So we're here talking about the longevity dividend. I'm going to start with David, because I'm going to begin macro and then we're going to start to drill down more. David, you and I cut our teeth in the early days of research looking at macroeconomics and demographic change, and it's about the aging society, old age dependency ratios, and for a long while we've been expecting this sort of gloom, a silver tsunami, rising old age dependency ratios, fewer workers, higher healthcare. How do you think that gloomy scenario has been playing out?
I think you're right that people get very gloomy about this. It amazes me that many economists who by nature are gloomy perhaps, still produce charts which show an old age dependency ratio, which is usually the ratio of two numbers. It's the proportion of the population aged between 16 and 64, and the proportion of the population that's over 64. And they show projections of that into the future, and they say this is awful, this is going to be really difficult, because there aren't enough people of what they call working age relative to the number of people who have to be supported. And people have been producing these pictures for decades now, and convinced themselves, and indeed many of the wider public, this is an awful problem. And I think what's bizarre about this, there's lots of bizarre things about this. Firstly, it's very strange to keep these age ranges constant. As we all know, life expectancy has gone up, and most of the increase in life expectancy are, as far as I can see, sort of relatively good, healthy years. Another thing that's really bizarre about these charts, and you do see them an awful lot, is that the proportion in the UK, I think this is probably true in many countries, but the UK data I'm familiar with, the proportion of the population who are aged over 65, who are still working, who are in the labour market, so-called participation ratio, is double now what it was in 2004. So even in a relatively short period of time, one of the parts of this ratio that people focus on has doubled. So it's a bit bizarre. And I think it does lead to all kinds of unfortunate views. The view that there is a terrible problem, that there won't be enough workers, there's too many people to support who can't look after themselves, sometimes leads to the ludicrous proposition that the reduction in fertility, which is, of course, another part of the phenomenon that drives this particular ratio up, the sort of lower number of young people that are being born relative to 20, 30, 40 years ago, the perception that, certainly in Europe, this is a huge problem, and that we have a fertility crisis, and that we must encourage more children to be born. We must increase the population rate, both in Europe and perhaps even globally, to stop this ratio, these fixed numbers, 64 plus as a ratio of 16 to 64. We must have ever-rising populations and possibly even accelerating growth of populations to stop this ratio rising. This is stark raving bonkers. I mean, the world has got too many people probably now. The growth of the population, which is going to be enormous anyway, is one of the huge problems of the world. So I do think that economists are very guilty, actually, for encouraging a view that aging, which brings with it all kinds of opportunities we've heard about today, is a huge problem. I think it's the opposite of that.
Yeah, I mean, Joe pointed the finger to economists, the dismal scientists, saying we turn this tremendous achievement of longer, healthier lives into a negative. And it is that use of the old age dependency ratio that's the heart of it. Yeah. I will come back, but thank you for that, David. I want to turn to Yvonne now. I mean, David pointed out that the participation rate and indeed the employment rate of older workers is increasing dramatically. And in the US over the last 20 years, the US has created 22 million extra jobs, employment. And if you were to look at where those jobs have come from, they haven't come from Brooklyn, they haven't come from Silicon Valley. 90% of those jobs have come from workers aged over 50. And similarly, you find the same sort of proportion in France and Germany, Japan, a little bit less in the UK. But of course, this is then impacting what firms are doing. So Yvonne, can you talk us through a little bit about what you see happening at the corporate level? Because if people want to work for longer, can they, and how are firms responding?
Yeah, well, we see organisations doing four main things at the moment. They're actually using much deeper look at analytics and business impact modelling to examine their own organisational data and to actually discover what drives business performance. Interestingly, and we've been looking for this evidence for years, it's really been the ROI that companies really need. It's that kickstart to keeping older workers in the population. Interestingly, using that type of analytics, we find that age-diverse teams outperform. I'll say that again. Age-diverse teams outperform. There's a lot of reasons for that. Experienced workers actually lower costs in the business because they're less likely to leave. The cost of a leaver is anywhere between 25 and 300% of an annual paycheck. So turnover is expensive. Interestingly, experienced and older workers also lower the turnover rate of the people they supervise. So their own teams turn over lower. They're like the glue that keep the teams together. A 5% reduction in turnover saved one of our clients $66 million a year. Experienced workers also increase productivity. Now, we did one study which looked at dozens and dozens of bank branches across the US. So all of these branches were pretty homogeneous. They all look the same. To really dive into what's driving performance in those bank branches, you can strip out all of the variables. The one strongest variable that drove performance across this bank was tenure, years of service. One extra year of service increased productivity in this bank by $40 million increased revenue. Yet 20% of job leavers in the UK in recent years, aged over 50, are being made redundant. It makes no sense. So we're encouraging more and more employers to examine their own organisational data to see what drives performance and then how to optimise that structure. And that could well be achieved through age-diverse teams. The second thing companies are doing, I think this one's a really interesting one, particularly for me. I grew up in the retirement industry, so pension schemes, sadly, have been my life for 30 years. But just looking at retirement plan design and flexible working together. Now, typically companies don't do that. They're very diverse teams. The retirement team and the team that might look after organisational structure and design don't speak the same language, so they often don't collaborate. But just looking at the impact of those two on how you can phase retirement, if we understand, and there'll be a lot of data from my talk because I'm a consultant after all, across the world's top 8 developed countries, there's already a $400 trillion savings gap. So that's the gap between what people have already saved and what they actually need to live out their lives. And that's manifesting in something like running out of money somewhere between 8 and 20 years before you die. So the prospect of living to 150, as you can imagine, fills me with horror because this is based on today's longevity and we're already 8 to 20 years short of that. Lots and lots of work around people wanting to work differently. In focus groups I did in the UK this summer, 4 out of 5 people want to work differently in future. Half of them want more flexibility, so winding down, and employers need to recognise that. That's multi-generational. It doesn't just affect older workers. But also, the other half actually wanted a new challenge, and already a lot of them have started to embrace that new challenge. So the third thing we're seeing companies doing is addressing ageist practices head on. So things like pay, promotion, bonus awards, performance grade, and hiring equity checks, not widely done at the moment. About 3 in 10 companies do this, but of those that do, around 2/3 of them say these are very effective in making me a much more age-friendly employer. And interestingly, even more shocking, is that only 1 in 10 companies examine the age distribution of training spend. And if they do, they'll find it's heavily skewed towards younger workers. And then finally, the fourth thing companies are doing, which I think is really paramount, is adopting an attitude to lifelong learning. One of the myths about older workers is they can't learn, they don't want to learn, they're slow at learning. And actually that's a conception some people hold of themselves, that they can't learn. As many as 57% of workers in the US in some states already have skills anxiety. So they feel they need more training and education to stay relevant for jobs of the future. And in focus groups I've done this year, we found as many as 62% of the over 50s prioritise lifelong learning in their future development plans. And 55% of them had already started to undertake new learning programs. So that's a few of the things that companies are doing to
Fantastic.
help.
I think both Dave and I, as professors, were surprised to hear you say that productivity increases with tenure, but I think you were probably using a different meaning of the word tenure there than the one that we were thinking of.
Long service.
Yeah, exactly, but very good to hear. By the way, we're using Slido. Please put your questions through and I'll try and feed them through to our panelists. Joe, I want to turn to you next because obviously if we're talking about the economic opportunities here, if you're talking about thematic investing, there's lots of interest in AI and robotics. I see more and more interest in green funds. What's the interest in this particular space? We obviously live in a world with very low interest rates. Investors should be searching for rates of return. Do you see much evidence of it yet? And if so, what form is it taking?
Yes, just before answering that, I want to state I'm not an economist. So,
you can be optimistic about everything then, that's fine. That's,
No, I think it's a very interesting question because it's a topic that we don't get much question on. And when people think about longevity, they don't really think about longevity, they think about aging. So if you think about the big themes that you have in the world, it could be the next gen, so the younger generation, it could be sustainability, climate change. But then when it comes to longevity and the fact that we live longer, it's not about the dividend. We heard about the dividend that we could have. It's more about what are the issues. And then you kind of think, oh, I want to have like some opportunities to invest in senior residence, or I want to invest in leisures that are targeted towards the older generation, or maybe some solution to help them. And we heard from Joseph that typically they are not very successful because they come with some sort of stigma for the population. So it's actually an investment thematic that doesn't work very well because it's not very well identified. The one part where you get money and where you see some success is more on the way to get older, that is healthcare, biotech, medtech. I think there you see interest because everyone wants to live longer, even though not everyone knows how they will use those years. But I think that's the key. And I think for the investor, that's what we get. But when you speak with, for example, engagement team at some of the very large companies in the UK, and I had the opportunity to do that last week, we spent 90% of our time talking about climate change, sustainability. And then after the meeting, I asked them, do you have any investor asking you about, maybe the more obvious one, the pension issue, the ticking bomb and all that? Not really. And are you thinking about solution for your own organization? He says, no, it's not on our agenda. So I think some companies are clearly doing it, but I think it's rather an exception rather than the norm.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of will-o'-the-wisp, elusive nature about longevity as an investment class. For the health reasons, the health fund market, I think it's well defined. But as Joe was sort of saying, I thought the example of glasses was a great one. It's just people in life buying things. I think the other challenge with aging, this theme of malleability that we're talking about, there's another part of that which is just diversity. And actually this is increasing, I think, a hard market to characterize because people age in very, very diverse ways. And we keep coming back to that when we talk about inequality, which of course is part and parcel of that malleability. But I think it also makes it a little bit more elusive as an investor category too. But Cynthia, I want to turn to you because of course the ARP is this extraordinarily prominent, successful and large institution. It's been driving an agenda around this for a long while. So perhaps you can give us the US perspective on where you're going and what you've been doing to support this market.
Certainly. Just a little bit of a little overview for those of you that aren't familiar with the ARP, and thank you, Linda and others, for the positive press that we've received today. We are a United States-based organization, nonprofit, nonpartisan. We have membership of nearly 38 million members, ages 50 and older. Our mission is to empower people to choose how they live as they age. And we do that by focusing on 3 areas that you've heard much about today, what we call health security, financial resilience, and personal fulfillment. It's health, wealth, and self is how we talk about it in the office. We have also become very involved. We recognize we can't do this alone, have become very involved on the global stage, participating in events like this, working with others, thought leaders, others on programs and policies that are also of interest to us, again, with the aging population. But from an economic perspective, we've done what I believe to be some very interesting things at AARP. Joe mentioned the longevity economy. In the United States, we think about that, or we've quantified that as $7.6 trillion of economic activity that is generated by the 50 plus, direct and indirect activity. And when we stepped back and looked at this, we said, we've got this enormous opportunity from an economic perspective. We're looking at the needs of the 50 plus. What can we do? How can we be a leader in this space? So we took an investment perspective and have made a couple of interesting bets in the venture capital space. We formed an innovation fund, the Aarp Innovation Fund, a $40 million private equity fund that focuses on providing capital to early stage companies in the consumer healthcare space. I'll speak a little bit more about that this afternoon. We, last year in commemoration of our 60th anniversary, formed the AARP Brain Health Fund, a $60 million venture capital fund that's focused strictly on finding a cure for dementia and Alzheimer's. Invested that money in the Dementia Discovery Fund, actually managed by a firm here in London, the DDF, managed by SV Health Investors. And we've done quite a bit in the marketplace in terms of innovation related to working with startup companies in designing products and services for the 50 plus in mind, and designing our own, curating our own.
So I think that's such an interesting example, and it's a unique organisation, ARP, and the fact you have that sort of level of funds to invest is impressive, and I think a great thing to do. Do you feel the need to do it because the market, I mean, you're obviously part of the market, but do you is this trying to be a catalyst? Do you think there's insufficient investment going into these areas?
It's some of both. We felt we needed to put our money where our mouth is, quite frankly. These are the policies, these are the positions that we advocate for, we find to be of benefit and what our members say they want. We felt we needed to be a market leader, we needed to set an example, and to help shape this space out there.
One question's coming through, and it's linked to something I was going to say. So ARP has this 50-year-old membership.
Yes.
If only I was American, I could apply to join. But we've been talking about sort of growing life expectancy. So of course, this is getting an ever larger number of people and a very diverse number of people. So I guess there's sort of two related questions to that. You know, is it a challenge to try and summarize what sort of the over 50s want? Because it will be hard to summarize what the under 50s want. And have you thought about raising the membership level?
Absolutely. To all of those questions you just asked, I've been at the organization for quite a while, and this has always been a topic of great debate. A couple of things. One is, yes, our membership is 50 plus, but we have now taken, and you've heard about it today, we've taken a life stage approach to this. Issues like caregiving leave, like livable communities, like what you're seeing in the workplace. Those are not necessarily in a specific age cohort. We're seeing them across the generations. So it's an opportunity. It's also an incredible challenge for us as an organization. Not only are we looking at membership at 50 plus, but we're looking at almost 38 million people. It's very hard to find, it's impossible, quite frankly, to find consensus among 38 million people. But what we do is we've taken this broad view to it. You asked if we've considered raising the age. Yes, we have. Again, a topic of great debate. My colleagues, we all have very different opinions and views about this, but and most recently, this came up a couple of years ago, the decision remains we will stay a 50-plus organization. Admittedly, it is challenging. The 50 to 64-year-olds are a bit more difficult to reach than the 65-plus. But that said, we believe that it's important that we are in this space, that we aren't just showing up at their doorstep when they turn 65 and in the United States start to really think about or move into retirement. That we need to be part of their life starting at a much younger age. And actually what we have been doing is working with younger organizations to make sure that we are forward thinking on this and anticipating rather than just all of a sudden, here I am, take a look at me.
So one of the things that worries me, I mean, David was talking about rising employment of people over 65. I mean, one of the other challenges with the old age dependency ratio, which assumes that everyone between 16 and 64 is working hard and producing, and everyone else is dependent on them. That's obviously quite an extreme assumption, because we also know that employment peaks at 50 in most countries, around about 50, and then starts to fall quite sharply. Now, that decline is happening more slowly now, which I think is part of this increasing labour force participation. But to me, that's kind of a really key policy area to focus on, because if people are living longer, we sort of talk about postponing the retirement age, but loads of people stop working after 50. Now, for those who want to stop working after 50, that's fine. Many people, though, have to do it because of ill health, and many people do it because they get laid off. And, of course, wages probably tend to rise with tenure as well. So I think that's one of the reasons why older workers get laid off. And although employment's rising, firms are not tending to hire older workers. So I wonder, Yvonne, if you wanted to comment on that. Is there any sign of a change there?
Yeah, I just pick up on the point about cost, actually, and that's another myth. Linda debunked tons of myths earlier. Fantastic. I love that. We're busy debunking a load of myths like this. So I remember one of the first employers I spoke to about this about 6 years ago was demographics are going to hit you, labour pools are shrinking, people are working longer because they're living longer, what are you going to do about that? And he said, well, we don't want old people because they cost us more and they're less productive, which is why I've spent the last 6 years trying to prove him wrong. On pay, actually, and there's 1 million data points I analysed for our latest research, 1 million data points across the UK, pay actually starts to tail off late 40s, early 50s for the same job by something like 0.5% to 7%. So pay actually tails off.
And that's in all that's
right
physical
across,
as well as non-physical
that's
work.
from unskilled right through to executive level. And the tail off is higher, interestingly.
We'll do a quick survey of the room whether their salaries are falling. We've got quite a lot of people in that age group, I think, at the moment.
Pay typically peaks somewhere between 40 and 50. So there's a tail off after that. In fact, there's lots of tail offs, including things like promotions, training allocation, hiring specifically. I mean, massive hiring discrepancies. One company I'm working with at the moment, their hiring rates in the under 50 bracket, something like 40-50%. By the time you get into the over 55s, they're less than 3% of annual turnover. And when they start to realise that, and this is indirect discrimination, and it's discrimination that's happening unconsciously without them even knowing. As they start to dig into some of these ageist practices, they're starting to change their tune. And interestingly, in the UK, in order to be legally compliant with the law on age discrimination, there needs to be an organisational strategy designed for older workers. That strategy needs to be implemented throughout the company and proactively managed in order to be legally compliant. So if companies are doing things like this that are preventing them from retaining, retraining and recruiting older workers, they may well be in breach of age discrimination legislation. In the US, as a litigation channel, it's the fastest rising litigation, age discrimination. So there's a big stick I'd like to be waving at these organisations to address some of these issues.
I want to come, Jared and David, a little bit. So Larry Summers, a very high-profile economist, says we're going through a period of secular stagnation. We've got low economic growth and we've got low interest rates. And he puts kind of ageing societies as part of that, because old people save a lot of money, they don't work, and so that's part of the sort of root problems we've got through. I mean, that goes against the notion we're talking about is more old people working and they're driving the GDP growth. I wondered if you felt that was a key part of what's happening to the macro trends at the moment.
Well, there is definitely a demographic thing, because what is missing right now is the investment, and I think with the older demographic, you tend to invest less, but also usually the quality of the infrastructure is already quite good. The example is Japan. If you go to Japan, and if you read about Japan being in Europe or the US, it sounds like it's been in deflation, depression for the last 20 years. Well, if you go to Japan, it's not that bad, to be honest. I think the quality of life is pretty good. The infrastructure is way better than in most places in Europe. And I think they realize that they need to use the demographic. I'm thinking in a way, we need an adjustment similar to what happened when women enter the workforce.
Yeah,
and basically with the old age. I mean, of course, there was some historical element that helped, wars and all that got women working. And I'm not sure if it's something we will be able to achieve as easily with the older generation, but it's really the same thing. And I think Japan is exactly doing that at the moment. For me, that's It's not a perfect illustration, but it is an illustration of having low growth and an older population doesn't mean that your quality of life has to get lower. Actually, I still think it's way better in Japan than in most places in the world.
And by the way, the other thing I always find interesting about the old age dependency ratio is actually been increasing in most countries about 100 years. And no one says, oh, that's caused doom and gloom. So quite why continual increases will cause doom and gloom. And part of the reason is exactly what you said, is that we had more and more older workers, but there's been a huge influx of women into the workforce. And I think going forward, it'll be the older workers who will do that. But David, how negative or positive right now do you think these demographic trends
there is a view out there, which is that the reason why interest rates have been driven down and down and down and are now extremely low is because of demographics. I must admit, I'm a little bit skeptical about that. It seems to me that one big reason why interest rates have gradually been coming down for the last 20 odd years now is that what's happened over the last 20 years is that an enormous part of the world economically, China, which was more or less cut off from the rest of the world economically, is now increasingly well integrated in the rest of the world, and Chinese households have had an extraordinarily high savings rate, and lots of that savings has been channeled into global financial markets, which wasn't true 20, 30 years ago. They have bought up globally a very large proportion of assets, certainly US Treasury bonds, enormous investment by Chinese households. That's, to my mind, the biggest single factor behind interest rates coming down and down, rather than demographics. It's that you take a huge economy, cut it off from the rest of the world, then open it out, and it's a part of the world with a very high savings rate. So I'm not sure that's anything to do particularly with demographics. I think it's to do with that. Just one point very briefly on the Larry Summers thing. Larry Summers, who is a very smart man, and he'll definitely tell you he's a very smart man if you ever come across him. He doesn't hold back on that. Part of his argument as to why we have a problem in developed economies is his argument is there's more saving going on than there are outlets for productive investment. And it's partly because economies have moved on over several decades, and they don't need to do so much heavy investment in, steel plants and building a railroad network, all kind of very heavy, capital-intensive things that went on through much of the 20th century. And we don't need to do that kind of stuff so much anymore, because lots of economic activity now doesn't involve very large-scale, heavy physical investment. People can set up a company with a few computers and rent a room, and the company can become very large and produce large amounts of GDP without the need for huge investment. That's not a bad thing, except it can mean, and the Summers view I think has something to it here, that you carry on saving at the rate historically you may have done in the past, but there isn't enough demand for the savings from people who want to do lots of investment, and that drives down interest rates and may create a situation where there's insufficient demand in the global economy. And that's one version of the secular stagnation story. I think if you believe that, I think there is something in that. If you believe that, then ultimately aging is part of a solution to that problem. And the reason I think is this, that if you think about the stages in life where people have the highest savings rates, they tend to be in their kind of 50s, maybe, from mid-40s through 50s is when people often have had the highest savings rates. They're not saving very much, maybe in their 20s and 30s, and they're generally not saving so much. They may not be running down their wealth very aggressively in their late 60s and 70s and 80s, but they're probably not adding to it, and therefore they've got quite a low savings rate. So as the demographics change very substantially over decades to come, it may be that the overall savings rate will move down a bit, because the proportion of people who are in their 70s, 80s, who've got quite low savings rates, they maybe have significant amounts of wealth, but low additions to that wealth, they're dis-saving to some extent. That will help this secular stagnation problem. So I think there's more good news to the aging story than gloomy economists can come up with.
Yeah, I mean, so it goes back to Joe Cotlin's point about, we turn it into bad news. If on average we're living longer and we're healthier for longer, we can be productive for longer. And that should be good news for the economy.
For sure.
So I guess the question is, how can we be productive for longer? Now, part of that is about how long we work for. There's a whole bunch of educational issues around that as well, and Yvonne was talking about lifelong learning. But I want to sort of come to, if we are seeing these increases in life expectancy, do you think we've got retirement at the right age now, or can we expect to see further increases in retirement? Cynthia, I wonder what you felt on that from an American point of view. Do you think are AARP pushing for a higher retirement age, pension age?
No, we are not. But that said, we are also planning for what we are all experiencing, which is we are living longer, we are working longer, and planning accordingly.
Okay.
So.
I'd just bring in a point on that. It's inevitable. One of the strongest pension systems in the world is Denmark, and their retirement age is now 72. And that's going to become quite the norm.
Yeah.
And just to add, retirement as we see it, well, especially maybe from a US perspective, is like going to Florida, enjoying the good life, cruises, etc. But retirement historically was not that. It was you were really not productive anymore because you were too old and you were put aside, and it was not something you were looking for, it's something you feared. And I think now we have to realize that people still want to be doing something useful most of the time. I think there's a limit to how many times you can go on the golf course or do something. And I think one part of the longevity, and we talked about biotech and medtech, for example, as a way to bring us there, but there's also the mental part of it. And I think in the previous presentation, I only caught the end of it, but there was being useful for society, you know, helping children, etc. I think the biggest cause for degradation in health above 70 is people that are isolated socially. And I think by basically pushing that, we would also help. It's almost like a win-win situation where people are useful for society and they also live longer and they have a feeling of fulfilling a purpose.
Yeah.
Oh, so I mean, Linda was talking about inventing that third demographic dividend,
Yes.
and it's about being productive in a way that's more than just about work. And we were talking about flexible working for older workers. We're talking about things like on-call fellows, where it's a work. But I think our concept of work and engagement will broaden much more beyond what it is right now. But if we're going to work for longer, I don't think any 45-year-old Danish people in the room, but what we've just been told is they've got more work to come than they've done already, which is quite a sobering thought, I think, if you're age 45. There's two things, and some of this is coming through the questions. How are we going to crack out our education at scale to keep people, working for longer, if they want to, or else we're just going to swap pension for unemployment? And secondly, will the jobs be there? We keep hearing about AI and robotics, and I try and refrain from answering this question myself, but, will the jobs be there?
The worst about the longevity crisis at the moment is it's coupled with the fourth industrial revolution. So jobs are changing exponentially. We don't know what jobs of the future are going to look like, and companies are really struggling with it. So not only are they facing this, how do we keep older workers for longer, how do we get our share of the labour pool, it's, well, what are those jobs and how do we reskill them? The way we're seeing success happen is when companies tackle this in a very sensible, logical way, and they start to analyse small pockets of their business, productive pockets of their business that are business critical for them, and look at, well, what jobs are we firing and what jobs are we hiring? PA to PM is a good example. One client we're working with, they're firing PAs, personal assistants, and that's typical. My PA used to look after me, now she looks after 11 of us. And on the other side of the coin, they're hiring project managers left, right and centre because they need them for contract work, etc. Now the skills overlap between a PA and a PM is about 2/3. And so actually transitioning those jobs on the firing line into those that they're rehiring can actually be very cost efficient for companies. And so tackling it in that way, you're addressing all of these issues at once. And that really is the only way companies can get their heads around it at the moment, because it's just too big a problem to tackle.
Cynthia?
As Yvonne said, I mean, it's reassuring to hear you say those things, because at AARP, for instance, we've done this in the IT area most recently as we've started to move to the cloud, as many organizations have. And rather than just laying off staff, we gave them lead time and said, these are the skills you're going to need, and you're going to need to be there by X. And if you are, there will be a job for you. And we've actually had some great success very, very recently.
Yeah. I mean, for me, there's two parts to this question. One is, will there be jobs? And I think there will be. The second is, will there be jobs that will be suitable for older workers? And if you look at the type of jobs that people say will grow in the wake of AI and robotics, it tends to be sort of more human-based skills. And I'm loath to have any age stereotypes, but in general, the sort of age stereotype, the positive age stereotypes about older people, are that that's the jobs that are actually going to grow in number. But David, you look like you wanted to say something.
I was smiling because there's a small group of commentators who you can read in the media and the press who are uniquely pessimistic. They seem to have convinced themselves of two things. I remember reading an article very recently, actually, by a quite well-known commentator, who said there are two big economic problems that we've got to face up to. It's really difficult. One is aging. Not enough people of working age. And the other is robotics. Not enough jobs. You think, hold on. Decide what you want to be pessimistic about, mate.
Yeah.
You know, but don't be...
The robots are coming just in time.
There's no jobs.
Yeah.
You know, and we haven't got enough workers to fill the jobs that there aren't. Anyway, gibberish. I can't remember what I was going to say now. I was sorry. I was just smiling. Remember?
Well, it's empathy that I would have thought people have in skill abundance, not memory.
Yes.
David, so.
Well, yes. I mean, there's something. I was going to make a sort of slightly different point, which I think we all recognise. It sort of comes back to the idiocy of focusing on a particular chronological age range and saying that the ratio of people in this group to that group is worrying because it didn't look like this 40 or 50 years ago and it's going in that direction. I mean, I grew up in South Wales. When I was very young, most of the jobs for men in South Wales were in mining, in steelworks and in the docks, and physically extraordinarily difficult jobs, and you basically couldn't do them. Most people couldn't do them once they got to about 45. And in South Wales now, like most of the UK, you know, they've all gone. They've all gone. And you can look at that and say, that's terribly sad. I mean, actually, I look at it in a more positive way, and it means that one of the great obstacles to people being able to work beyond, 45 has just disappeared. It's never been less purely physically demanding to work.
George wants to...
Yeah, I just wanted to say, through the whole discussion we're having, we see that in a way the society is stuck in some mental block. I mean, we talk about the participation rate, and we're all talking about the, above 65. But I'm most struck by 15 to 64. Who start working at 15? I mean, in Switzerland, in Switzerland, it's actually maybe the case because apprenticeship, 80% of the population do an apprenticeship and they start at 16, which is why I think the pension system is actually okay in Switzerland. But in France, where I'm from, like 80% of the people are pushed to study to go to university. Yeah. So that's one point. But the point is that we're stuck in those systems. And going back to Denmark, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they, for example, give you the opportunity to resign and still get paid for 12 months to retrain, which I think is, that's a big problem because a lot of people are hanging to their job because they need it, for the family, their everyday spending, and they can't afford to say, I'm going to take a leave for a year and not get any benefits, which would happen in most of the countries because if you leave, you don't get unemployment because it was your decision. And I think maybe there are some ways to push people to do that. If you ask people on the job, are you happy with what you do? Most of the people will say no. But again, not being happy in a relationship is different than going for divorce because you have to find it has to be very extreme for you to go to that level. And I think maybe if people had a bit of a safety net, they would be more willing to move ahead. And that could be done by, let's say, if you agree that you retire later, you take a bit of your pension out, we subsidize it, and you retrain using a bit of what you were supposed to get at 70 and maybe it's going to be 75 now. I think there are some solutions that needs to be put in place.
The ultimate answer is some new style employment contract, a much more flexible approach to working, coupled with the skills and training opportunities. But people have to look at this through a number of lenses. You have to think, and maybe this is the answer, we're looking at something which is a nice diagnostic, so a sort of midlife MOT, if you like, and looking at your health, your wealth and yourself, actually very similar to the AARP model, and analysing, well, what do my finances look like? Can I afford to work less? Can I afford to go back to school? Can I afford to retire? At what age can I afford to retire? Am I healthy enough to plot that life course? Am I skilled enough? Are my values in life being met? So doing that type of diagnostic midlife, and it's compulsory in France, I believe, a midlife checkup. So that approach, combined with a more flexible employment style contract, is the ultimate goal.
The other thing, which goes back to our conversation about ARP and 50 years as being a special number, I do find we get sucked in these conversations about older workers, and we have, well, some people want to work, some people have to work, and that's all true, but that's true throughout the whole labour market. And actually, increasingly, I think what we need to think about is this set of older workers. Some have specific issues, but actually, again, they're just people and have all the sort of labour market issues that everyone of any age also has. If I can just ask the audience to join in a little bit here. We've got one question that I personally will find you on Slido, be interested to get your answers to. It's question 17, if you can get your devices out. So what is the most important step needed to seize a longevity dividend? And yeah, my device isn't working. So can we have that on the screen, or is that going to be impossible? Oh, there it goes. So if we can just tell the panel what you think is the most important thing for seizing a longevity dividend. 3 people have voted so far. Okay, there we go. Okay. Well, we have been working for longer than we said we would, because we've overrun the scheduled time, which is like your participation rate has been very good. So we will have a break now, I think, is the schedule, and we're going to begin again at 10 minutes past 4. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you.